Ethan Cole gripped the controls of his ship, white knuckles betraying his calm exterior. He'd been adrift for hours, maybe days, in the farthest, most forgotten corner of space. His breath was shallow, heart pounding against his ribs as the systems panel flashed critical failure warnings at him like a death sentence. Come on, come on. He muttered, hands moving over the controls in a desperate attempt to restart the engines. The soft hum of life support was the only sound in the cabin, a haunting reminder that every second of silence brought him closer to the inevitable. Then came the flash. A light so bright and sudden it blinded him for a second. When his vision cleared, his heart sank. A ship, massive and predatory, loomed before him. Its black metal hull was jagged, scarred from battles fought long before Ethan ever left Earth. His ship's proximity alarm shrieked as the vessel closed in, and through the cockpit window, he saw it, the Slaver Empire's insignia, a jagged claw wrapped around a planet, a symbol known and feared across the galaxy, panic clawed at his chest. He had no weapons, no backup, and nowhere to run. Before he could even think of a plan, his ship jerked violently. The tractor beam locked on, pulling him towards the slaver ship like a fly caught in a web. Ethan slammed his fists against the console. Not like this, he growled, desperation taking over. But no matter what he tried, his systems were unresponsive. The slavers were drawing him in, as the slaver ship loomed closer, its dark maw opening to swallow him whole. Another explosion of light filled the void, this one a blaze of blue energy bolts streaking across space. Ethan blinked, barely processing what was happening before he saw it, another ship, smaller but more menacing, darting in and out of the slavers' fire, hitting with deadly precision. The slaver's vessel shuddered under the assault, and the tractor beam released its grip on Ethan's ship. He wasn't out of danger yet, though. His ship was still floating, dead in the water, and the slavers were far from defeated. But the mysterious ship, his unexpected savior, continued its relentless barrage, taking out one slaver system after another until the larger vessel retreated into the blackness of space. Ethan's breath came in shallow gasps. His life had just been seconds from ending, or worse, being sold into slavery on some backwater planet. He leaned back in his seat, adrenaline still coursing through his veins, when his proximity alarm went off again. This time, it was the smaller ship. Before he could react, it docked with his craft. A loud metallic clang echoed through the hull as the airlock hissed open. He reached for his emergency knife, but before he could even stand, the door slid open, and she stepped inside, an alien, tall, with dark, angular armor that shimmered in the dim cabin light. Her eyes, sharp and electric, scanned the room until they landed on him. A smirk tugged at her lips. "You're mine now," she said, her voice low and commanding. Ethan stared at her, chest tight. He was saved, but at what cost? Ethan shot to his feet, still gripping the knife like it would somehow level the playing field between him and the towering alien who had just claimed ownership of him. She stepped closer, her posture rigid, yet oddly graceful. Her armor gleamed under the flickering lights of his damaged ship, casting long shadows that danced across the walls. "Excuse me?" he said, voice shaking with both adrenaline and confusion. "Yours?" "I don't think so." The alien woman crossed her arms, her electric blue eyes glowing faintly as they studied him. A thin smirk tugged at her lips, but there was no warmth in it. "By the laws of my people, you are bound to me. I saved your life. Now, you owe me yours in return." Ethan's pulse raced, a mixture of anger and disbelief coursing through him. "I didn't ask for your help," he shot back, tightening his grip on the knife. "I didn't ask to be saved by anyone, let alone to become someone's property." Her smirk faded, replaced by a cold, calculating stare. "Had I not intervened, the slavers would have taken you. You'd be caged right now, or worse. Is that the fate you prefer?" He hesitated, his bravado faltering. She was right, of course. If she hadn't arrived when she did, he'd be on his way to some brutal fate at the hands of the slaver empire. But being indebted to an alien warrior wasn't much of a consolation prize either. I don't owe you anything, Ethan said, forcing his voice to steady. I'll fix my ship and be on my way. The alien woman took another step closer, her presence dominating the small space. Fix your ship. She echoed, her voice laced with amusement. Your ship is barely holding together. You won't last 10 minutes out here alone. Ethan's mind raced, calculating his options. She wasn't wrong, his ship was a wreck, and he was in the middle of hostile territory. But the idea of being tethered to her, some warrior captain from a race he didn't even know, wasn't something he could stomach. What's your name? He asked, trying to shift the conversation. Her gaze remained unwavering. I am Captain Zara of the Thrain Fleet, she replied, her voice like steel. And you will address me as such. Ethan shook his head. Look, Zara, Captain, whatever you want to call yourself, I'm not going along with this. Life debt or not, I'm not yours to claim. Zara's eyes narrowed, her expression turning cold again. Then you'll die out here. The slavers are not the only threat in this region. Without me, your chances of survival are non-existent. Ethan stared at her, chest tight with frustration. He hated feeling powerless, hated that she had the upper hand. But deep down, he knew she was right. If he tried to leave now, he wouldn't make it far. Fine, he muttered, lowering his knife. But I'm not some servant. I'll work with you, until I figure out how to get back to Earth. Zara gave a slight nod. We'll see how long that attitude lasts, she said, her voice sharp. Then, with a flick of her wrist, she turned and began inspecting his ship, already acting as if it was hers to command. Ethan clenched his jaw. He wasn't out of danger. He was just in a different kind of cage. The hum of Captain Zara's ship reverberated beneath Ethan's feet as he sat in the cramped cockpit, watching her at the controls. Her movements were precise, every flip of a switch and touch of a panel executed with a fluid efficiency that only years of battle-hardened experience could bring. Ethan's mind raced with questions, but the silence between them was as vast as the stars outside. His ship was tethered to hers now, barely functional, while Zara's vessel cut through the cold expanse of space like a predator stalking its next target. So, what's the plan? Ethan finally broke the silence, arms crossed as he leaned back in his seat. You're just gonna haul me around like some space souvenir until you get bored? Zara didn't look at him, her eyes fixed on the glowing navigation screen. The plan, she said calmly, is to survive. You think the slavers were bad? This quadrant is crawling with things that make them look like children playing soldier. Ethan frowned. The tension in his shoulders growing. Why are you even out here? You don't strike me as the charitable type. Her jaw tightened, but she kept her focus on the controls. I wasn't looking for you, if that's what you mean. I had my reasons. Great, Ethan muttered. So now I'm stuck in the middle of some galactic mess I didn't ask for. Zara shot him a sidelong glance, her expression hard. You're not stuck. You're alive. That's more than most in this sector can say. Ethan opened his mouth to argue, but the ship suddenly jolted, throwing him forward. He caught himself on the edge of the console as warning lights flared red across the screen. Zara's eyes narrowed. Damn, she hissed under her breath. Hold on. Ethan barely had time to process the words before the ship lurched again, violently this time, the entire cabin shaking. The stars outside twisted and blurred as Zara yanked the controls, trying to steer the ship out of whatever had just grabbed them. What the hell is happening? Ethan shouted, his heart pounding in his chest. Zara's face was set in grim determination. Interdiction field. Someone's pulling us out of hyperspace. Before Ethan could respond, the stars snapped back into sharp focus, and the ship stopped dead in the void. But they weren't alone. A massive cruiser loomed ahead, dwarfing Zara's ship by a terrifying margin. Its sleek, black surface was dotted with cannons and strange, pulsing lights, a beast of war designed for destruction. Ethan's blood ran cold. What is that? Zara's lips pressed into a thin line. Pirates. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. Pirates in this sector were worse than slavers. These weren't raiders looking to capture and sell, they were murderers who left nothing but wreckage in their wake. Zara's hands danced over the controls, activating the ship's weapons system. "Stay behind me," she ordered, her voice tight with command. "They won't hesitate to kill us both." Ethan nodded, fear clawing at his insides. His instincts screamed at him to run, but there was nowhere to go. Nowhere to hide, the pirates had found them, and there was no escape. The pirate cruiser loomed like a black hole, swallowing all light around it. Ethan's pulse hammered in his ears as the dread of what was coming sank into his bones. Zara, unflinching, tapped commands into her ship's console with an eerie calm. But Ethan knew enough to sense the odds weren't in their favor. Zara glanced at him, her eyes narrowing. "You've got two choices, Earthling. Stay out of my way, or grab a gun." Ethan swallowed hard. "I don't exactly have military training." "You've got hands, don't you?" "You shoot where I tell you," she snapped, tossing him a sleek blaster from the weapons rack. "Now buckle up." A voice crackled over the comms, guttural and mocking. "This is Captain Rax of the Blood Fawn. Power down your ship, and maybe, just maybe, we'll let you keep your skins." The transmission ended with a raspy laugh, sending a shiver down Ethan's spine. Zara smirked, her fingers dancing over the control panel. "They underestimate us." Before Ethan could ask what she meant, the ship lurched forward at full speed. His stomach dropped as they shot straight toward the massive cruiser, weaving between debris and firing off a volley of energy blasts. Zara's eyes blazed with focus, her mouth set in a determined line. "What are you doing?" Ethan shouted, gripping the blaster as he was slammed back into his seat by the force of acceleration. "Surviving," Zara growled, pulling a hard maneuver that made the entire ship creak in protest. A streak of laser fire grazed their hull, sending sparks flying across the cockpit. The pirate cruiser opened fire, unleashing a barrage of glowing plasma bolts. Zara spun the ship in a wild corkscrew, dodging the blasts with an almost inhuman precision. Ethan's heart raced as he caught glimpses of the cruiser's massive cannons, tracking them like predators. "Hold on!" Zara shouted, and without warning, she hit a button on the console that sent the ship into a violent nosedive, diving beneath the cruiser's belly. The move was so sharp Ethan felt his insides twist, but the pirates weren't expecting it. The larger ship's cannons couldn't adjust quickly enough. "Now!" Zara barked, and Ethan reacted purely on instinct, squeezing the trigger on the blaster. Energy bolts streaked toward the cruiser's underside, hitting a cluster of exposed conduits with a fiery explosion. The cruiser shuddered, its shields flickering for a brief moment. Ethan stared in disbelief. "Did I just hit them?" But there was no time to celebrate. The pirate's ship retaliated with a brutal counterstrike, and Zara's ship took a direct hit. The cockpit lights flickered as alarms blared. They were losing power. Ethan's panic surged. "We can't take another hit like that." Zara gritted her teeth, her hands flying over the controls as she rerouted power to the engines. "We won't have to." Her eyes gleamed with a dangerous glint. "One more pass, and we break for the nebula." Before Ethan could protest, she pushed the throttle to maximum, hurtling them back toward the cruiser. The ship rattled violently as more blasts flew past them, close enough that Ethan could feel the heat. Zara aimed for the cruiser's damaged section, firing another volley of blasts just before banking hard to the right. The cruiser's cannons missed their mark, firing into the void as Zara's ship disappeared into the dense, swirling cloud of the nebula. Ethan collapsed back into his seat, breathless. "Did we just survive?" Zara glanced at him, her smirk returning. "Barely. But don't get too comfortable. The pirates will be back." Ethan stared at her, pulse still racing. His life was spiraling further out of control with every passing minute, and somehow, this alien warrior was the only thing keeping him alive. For now, the nebula swallowed them in a blanket of swirling gas and cosmic dust, turning the view from the cockpit into an eerie haze of blues and purples. The pirate cruiser had disappeared from sight, but Ethan knew they were still being hunted. His heart raced as Zara worked furiously at the controls, recalibrating the ship's systems. Sparks flew from a damaged console, and the hum of the engine sputtered ominously. "How long before they find us again?" Ethan asked, his voice tense. Zara didn't look up. "Not long. But in here, their sensors will be scrambled. It buys us time, not safety." Ethan clenched his fists, frustration boiling beneath his fear. He had barely escaped the slavers, and now he was running from pirates. Each moment felt like he was slipping further and further away from any chance of returning to Earth. He glanced over at Zara, who was still working with military precision, as if this chaos was routine for her. "Maybe it was. Why did you save me?" he asked suddenly, the question that had been gnawing at him since this nightmare began. "Why pull me from the slavers? You didn't have to." Zara's hands stilled for a moment, her expression unreadable. "I've seen too many fall to them. Too many who didn't deserve it." "That's not an answer." She finally looked at him, her eyes hard but not unkind. "I don't owe you one." Ethan's frustration flared. "You claim I owe you my life, but you won't even tell me why you saved it. That's rich." Zara's jaw tightened, but she didn't snap back at him like he expected. Instead, she leaned back in her seat, the tension in her shoulders easing just a fraction. "You remind me of someone. Someone I couldn't save." Ethan blinked, caught off guard by the vulnerability in her voice. "Who?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she stared out at the nebula, her electric blue eyes reflecting the swirling gases outside. "My brother," she said quietly. "We were ambushed by slavers. I made it out. He didn't." Ethan felt a pang of guilt for pressing her. For a moment, the hardened alien warrior sitting across from him seemed human. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I'm sorry," he muttered. Zara nodded, her gaze still distant. "You don't need to be. It was a long time ago." Before Ethan could say more, the ship's console beeped, breaking the silence. Zara's eyes snapped to the screen, her expression hardening. "They're closing in." Ethan's stomach dropped. "How close?" "Too close. We won't be able to outrun them in this state." She stood abruptly, moving to a storage compartment and pulling out a large, metallic cylinder. "We're going to have to fight our way out." Ethan swallowed, his throat dry. "Fight? With what?" Zara turned to him, the faintest trace of a smile tugging at her lips. "With everything we've got." The gravity of their situation hit him like a freight train. They were outgunned, outnumbered. And trapped in the middle of a nebula with pirates hunting them down. But somehow, Zara's unwavering confidence made him believe, if only for a moment, that they might just survive this. As she handed him another blaster, her eyes gleamed with that dangerous spark he had come to know. "Ready, Earthling?" Ethan took the weapon, nodding despite the fear gnawing at him. "Ready as I'll ever be." They stood side by side in the cramped cockpit, the silence heavy with anticipation. The pirates were coming. But this time, they wouldn't be running, they'd be waiting. The nebula churned outside, twisting in vibrant spirals of color that concealed everything beyond. But deep within its chaos, the pirate ship emerged, its shadowy form cutting through the clouds like a predator stalking its prey. Zara stood at the front of the cockpit, her hands steady on the controls, her eyes locked on the approaching threat. Ethan could feel the tension radiating off her, but it wasn't fear, no, it was something else. Determination. Resolve. And it was infectious. "Brace yourself," Zara said, her voice low but clear. "We're going to draw them in close. Let them think they have us cornered." Ethan glanced at the blaster in his hands, feeling its cold weight. He had never fired a weapon before today, and now his survival depended on it. His pulse quickened, but a strange calm settled over him. Zara had saved him, had fought for him, and now he would fight too. The pirate cruiser came into view, its cannons glowing with lethal energy. Ethan watched in awe and terror as it filled the viewport, its massive form dwarfing their own ship, their charging weapons. Ethan muttered, the panic creeping back into his voice. "What's the plan?" Zara's lips curled into a sharp smile. "We fight like hell." With a sudden burst of speed, Zara launched their ship forward, directly at the cruiser. Ethan's heart leapt into his throat. "What are you doing?" "They expect us to run," she said through gritted teeth. "I'm giving them the opposite." The ship veered toward the cruiser's underbelly, the cannons firing just behind them. The cockpit rattled violently as Zara pushed the engines to their limit, skimming past the enemy's firing range. Ethan gripped his seat as the pirate ship's hull loomed just overhead, close enough to see the scorch marks from their earlier attack. Zara's hands flew across the controls, her focus razor-sharp. "Now," she barked, slamming a button on the console. Ethan barely had time to process the sound of an explosive charge detonating beneath the cruiser. A violent tremor shook both ships, and Ethan saw the flash of fire and debris as the pirates' shields flickered. Weakened by the hit. The pirate cruiser, wounded but still dangerous, reeled from the blast. "But they weren't down yet, they're going to board us." Ethan shouted, watching as grappling hooks shot out from the cruiser, latching onto Zara's ship with a sickening thud. The air in the cockpit seemed to grow colder as the reality sank in. There was no escape now. Zara unholstered her weapon, her expression grim. "Then we fight on our terms." The sound of metal groaning filled the ship as the pirates forced their way inside. Ethan's hand tightened on his blaster. The door to the cockpit burst open with a deafening crash, and the first pirate charged through, an alien brute with jagged armor and a snarling face. Zara moved like lightning. A single shot from her blaster dropped the pirate before he could raise his weapon. But more followed, their guttural war cries filling the narrow corridor. "Stay close." Zara shouted as she fired into the fray, her aim precise, each blast lethal. Ethan, trembling, raised his own blaster and squeezed the trigger. The shot went wide, missing its target, but he fired again, determined not to falter. The pirates surged forward, their sheer numbers overwhelming the small space. Zara fought with a ferocity that stunned Ethan, taking down enemies with swift, brutal efficiency. But it wasn't enough. There were too many. "Zara!" Ethan cried out as a pirate knocked her blaster from her hands. She spun, her fists flying in a vicious hand-to-hand fight, but the pirate was massive, overpowering her. Without thinking, Ethan charged, firing wildly at the brute. One shot found its mark, striking the pirate square in the chest. He staggered, giving Zara the opening she needed. With a final, savage blow, she brought the pirate down. Breathing hard, Zara looked at Ethan, her eyes flashing with a mixture of surprise and something else. "Respect. Nice shot, Earthling," she said, a hint of a grin breaking through the grim tension. But the battle wasn't over. The cruiser shuddered again, alarms blaring. The pirates had damaged the ship beyond repair. "We've got to get out of here," Zara said, pulling Ethan toward the emergency escape pod. As the pod ejected, Zara's ship, with the pirate cruiser still attached, erupted into flames, consumed by the nebula's volatile gases. Ethan stared at the destruction, his mind reeling. But Zara's hand on his shoulder grounded him. "We survived," she said, her voice steady. "For now," Ethan replied, the weight of their next fig.